We're starting a brand new series today. We've spent the last few weeks in a series called Find Your People, where hopefully you have been able to find your place and find your people here at Uncharted. This week, we are starting what a series that we'll be in over the next few weeks, just covering the life of really a remarkable man. I'm going to jump right in here. Daniel chapter 1. During the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, Azariah was called Abednego. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths of your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded." Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. "Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water," Daniel said. "At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see." The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So, after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. I want to start with this. Daniel never expected that he would end up in Babylon. I want you, through this introduction of this study we're doing here, to try to picture Daniel as best as you can. And to the best of your ability, pause for a moment, try to picture Daniel. We actually have a fairly clear picture of what he was like from verses 3 and 4. We know that he was bright and quick to understand. It says he was one of the best in Israel. It says he was handsome. He was a good-looking, physically flawless guy. He was bright and smart and quick to understand. He came from a family of high social status, and he would have dreamed of all the things that a young man at his time would have dreamed of. He had commitment to God and God's community. And he would have, back in Judah, a fairly predictable future. He would have been able to expect going to a great school, and then total success in whatever field he chose, a fulfilling marriage, raising an amazing family in a wonderful home, eventually would have had a prominent place in the temple, doing great things for his God and his people. But things didn't turn out like Daniel planned. All those dreams, all those hopes, they didn't work out for him. In those first 2 verses, there's this world of heartbreak in them. Nebuchadnezzar went and besieged Jerusalem. The heartbreak is this. God had made a promise long time ago to Abraham that he would become a community through which God would bless the entire world. And that promise sustained the Israelites for centuries and centuries and centuries of heartbreak. And now Daniel is a young man, and what seems to be the last little bit of God's promise has been shattered. Nebuchadnezzar comes in, he besieges Jerusalem, he destroys the temple, he hauls away all these sacred objects and put them in his own store with his own gods, and he hauls away Daniel as a POW. Daniel, who had such a promising future, now has everything taken away from him. The culture he loves, the relationships that he cherishes, everyone he knows is taken away. He's hauled away to spend the best years of his life serving an alien king in a foreign land, speaking a foreign language. He would never go home. He would live and die in Babylon, serving this foreign king that he never wanted to serve. The text even says that they even gave him a new name. And this name deal is really significant because Daniel, along with his three friends, all of their original Hebrew names referenced God in their name. It was this reminder for them that they belong to God. And the Babylonians want them to begin to believe that you need to be forged by Babylon. Let Babylon forge your identity. Let Babylon shape who you are. That's the idea of it. And so this promise seems to be shattered. So, what do you do when you end up in Babylon? Because you will. If you haven't experienced it yet, you'll end up there. Babylon is the place you find yourself when life didn't go like you planned it. When all your dreams, all these things that you really hoped for didn't work out. You're cut off from the life you intended. It could be a relationship or even a marriage that you had big dreams for didn't work out. It could be a career that you hoped would end up happening, what didn't end up happening. It could be a loved one, a deep loved one who wounded or betrayed you. Or maybe it's a deep prayer that you've been praying for a long time, and now you're starting to realize that it's never going to be answered the way you hoped it would be. Whatever it is, you find yourself in Babylon, cut off from the life that you hoped you would have, and you don't think you'll ever go home. And worst of all, you wonder if God even knows about it. Does God even notice you? Does he even care? How could he let this happen? What do you do when you end up in Babylon? That's what I want to talk about today. Researchers have done a ton of work, tons of different studies on this. They've studied all different kinds of people who have experienced tremendous amounts of trauma and crisis in their lives. They've done studies on POWs from the Korean War, POWs from the Vietnam War, hostages, the 52 hostages that survived 14 months in Iran, individuals and families who have survived a decade or more living in Casper, Wyoming. Not on the last one here. But what they've found in these studies, unsurprisingly, is that a lot of people, when they go through these things, they're just defeated. They're just withered in their spirit. But interestingly, what they also found is that there are some people who they experience this crisis and they experience this trauma and they actually grow from it. Something about them, they have enlarged their capacity to deal with challenging and difficult situations. These researchers have come to call these people resilient. The character resilient, when someone is able to thrive in really, really challenging situations. And they found that there's a common set of characteristics that make someone a resilient person. The reason we're looking at Daniel, and the reason I want to show you his life, is because in Daniel, we have one of the most spiritually resilient people who've ever lived. And we can see the characteristics in his life and see what makes him spiritually resilient. So I'm going to spend today walking us through chapter 1 of Daniel, and along the way, I'm going to point out a few different characteristics made him spiritually resilient person. What do we do when we end up in Babylon? Here's the first thing. Spiritually resilient people resolve to honor God. They don't view themselves as pawns of circumstances beyond their control. They don't think of themselves as these helpless victims of this world that is acting on them. They say, no, whatever happens, I'm drawing a line in the sand. I'm going to resolve my heart to honor God, to not get tangled up in things that would cause me to sacrifice my deepest values and commitments. We see this in verse 8. In many ways, verse 8 is actually a hinge point of the whole book, especially of chapter 1, but it's really a hinge point of the whole book because up until verse 8, everything has been determined by the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar determines to besiege Jerusalem. He determines to take out the temple. He determines to haul back the sacred objects to Babylonia. He determines who to take captive and to take POWs back. And then the dean of the school, the chief of staff here, determines what the curriculum is going to be, what the subject matter will be, what the entrance criteria is. He determines their new names. But then verse 8, Daniel determines. And the author actually kind of shows this in a colorful way. It doesn't show up well in most translations, but the literal rendering of it would be in verse 7, the chief of staff determined new names for them. He determined Belshazzar for Daniel, and then verse 8, but Daniel determined. It's a hinge point. Everything shifts. Now, Daniel determines. Now he resolves. Now he decides. Daniel, the POW. Daniel, the captive. He takes initiative. People who are spiritually resilient, they resolve deep in their hearts that they aren't going to get tangled up with anything that could cause them to sacrifice their deepest commitments and values. They aren't going to do it. We see this as Daniel sort of draws this line in the sand. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. So this takes some effort from him on his part. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. It isn't real clear from the text what made them unacceptable, what was wrong with the food. It could have been that since the king ate them, they were offered to idols and that would defile him. Could have been that the type of food was ceremonial unclean and had ceremonial law problems for him. We don't really know. It's not clear. But we just know for Daniel, this was the line in the sand that he had to draw where he started to say, no, I have to honor God here. So he goes to the chief of staff. He goes to the dean of this school to ask him. And you need to know how much courage this took from Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar was not a king who cut people a lot of slack. In 2 Kings 25, it tells us a story about how a puppet king, Zedekiah, rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar went and captured him and his family and then killed his sons in front of him and then put out his eyes. So the last thing that Zedekiah sees is his sons getting killed in front of him and then he loses his eyes. You've heard of leaders who have a hands-on or a hands-off management style. Nebuchadnezzar had a heads-off management style. Cross Nebuchadnezzar, lose your head. Anyone here ever had a really tough boss? Anyone ever had a boss who was so tough that when he terminated people, he terminated people? That's the kind of guy Daniel is dealing with here. That's the kind of risk he's taking. Tremendous initiative and courage on his part. But he resolves, I'm not going to be a victim of my circumstances. So he goes to the dean of the school. Dean of the school says, well, I would, except King Nebuchadnezzar might have my head because if you're eating this different kind of just vegetable food than we're feeding you, then you're going to be all low energy and pale and thin and you aren't going to be healthy and then I'm responsible. So Daniel hears that and he's like, well, that's not exactly a yes, but that isn't exactly a no. So next he goes to the guard, the next level down in the org chart, and he proposes this experiment to him. He says, let me try this with me and my friends for 10 days. Just give us the vegetables for 10 days, and at the end of the 10 days, let's see who's looking better. And then if we're looking good enough, we can stick with this diet. And so the guard agrees. And it went so well that at the end of the 10 days, they looked so good, they switched the entire school to Daniel's diet. And he rose to head of the class, became valedictorian from there. But notice that this didn't happen all at once. When all seemed lost, this happened because Daniel resolved, I'm going to honor God. I'm not going to get tangled up in these things that keep this from happening. This story comes from Ken Davis. He shares this. It happened at a traffic light near the edge of town. A man gunned the engine of his huge Harley-Davidson motorcycle as he waited for the light to change. You might have been tempted to stare at this guy, and he would have enjoyed it. A filthy rag fastened around his head. From beneath it, a matted tangle of oily gray hair spilled down the back of his leather jacket. Images of skulls and bones leered from his clothing and his bare forearms, and his bike bore the emblem of a menacing black widow spider. As he waited at the light, an elderly man in a lime green moped pulled up beside him. The ring-a-ding-ding of the moped was drowned out by the roaring thunder of the Harley. "Boy, that's some motorcycle you got there," the old man croaked. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Scowling from behind his oily beard, the biker gave him the once-over. "If it turns your crank, old-timer," he snarled, "go ahead." The old man was a little far-sighted, but he wanted to take in all the scenery. So he leaned his face right over the bike, examined every inch. Looking up after a while, the old man grinned. "I bet that motorcycle goes fast." But no sooner were the words out of his mouth, the light changed. The biker thought he'd show this old geezer what a real chopper could do. He gave it full throttle, and within 30 seconds, the speedometer read 199 miles an hour. He chuckled with satisfaction. Suddenly, he noticed a dot in his rearview mirror. A dot that was growing larger. Something was gaining on him. What could it be? He slowed down to get a better look, and whatever the thing was, it flashed past him so fast he couldn't identify it. The thing disappeared over the horizon, whipped around, and came right back at him. As it zipped past, he recognized the rider. It was the old man on the lime green moped. How could this be? The biker took another look into his rearview mirror. There was that speck again, coming back his way and growing larger. The biker tried to outrun it, but it couldn't be done. It was a moot point in seconds, for the moped slammed into the rear of the Harley-Davidson. The collision destroyed both bikes. You could hear the impact for miles. The biker extricated himself from the mangled steel pretzel that had once been his beloved Harley-Davidson. But the old man had fared even worse. He lay groaning beneath the black and smoking remnants of his moped. Even the hardened biker was moved with compassion. He knelt beside the old man's face and softly asked, "Is there anything I can do for you?" The old man choked, coughed, and replied, "Yes. Could you please unhook my suspenders from your handlebars?" Such a vivid image, isn't it? Well, Ken Davis goes on to write this. "You and I would never purposely hook our suspenders to anything dangerous. And yet many of us might be willing to lean over for a closer look. The world around us is littered with the mangled lives of men and women who never intended to get hooked. They only wanted to get a closer look at the shiny colors of some forbidden sin. Got tangled up in Babylon. This is the man who never intended to sabotage his family, but flirted along the boundaries of adultery. Or the business person who cut ethical corners to get to the top faster, collision waiting to happen. Many of us, we don't intentionally sabotage our relationships in life. We just slowly drift into resentment or bitterness or hate. And then we wake up one day and we realize we crashed. Sometimes the enemy is more subtle. Sometimes it's hurry or distraction or success. And we get tangled up in Babylon. Is there anywhere you're tangled up? There may be someone here today who you're viewing yourself as this helpless victim, just this like pawn that is totally out of control to the forces of life around us. Resolve today. Make this deep commitment. You're going to hold true to your values. You're going to hold true to what matters most to you in your life. This is the one life God has given us. Resolve today. We're going to do something with it. We're going to honor God. We're going to live for God. So that's the first one. Spiritually resilient people resolve to honor God. Second, spiritually resilient people live in community. Now, we spent the last few weeks talking about this, so I'm not going to spend much time on this, but Daniel had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He actually had his own little group of people that he was able to spend time with, that he surely would have prayed with, would have encouraged, would have supported, would have processed things with. We all need this. Julius Siegel is a top researcher in this, and he writes that few captives suffered more than Vice Admiral James Stockdale, who served 2,714 days as a POW in Vietnam. On one occasion, his captors shackled his legs and arms and left him in glaring sunshine 3 blistering days, while guards beat him repeatedly to keep him from sleeping. After one beating, Stockdale heard a towel snapping out in a code that the POWs had devised. A message he would never forget. It's 5 letters. GBUJS. God bless you, Jim Stockdale. For these POWs, the briefest experiences of community, of being connected, became literally a life or death deal. Their devotion and ingenuity to make community happen in spite of unbelievable obstacles defies belief. If one man walked by another cell, he would drag his sandals in code to send a message. Men sent messages to their comrades through the noises they made shaking out their blankets, by belching, snoring, blowing their noses, and other bodily noises that I will not name, but are usually mastered by 10-year-old boys. It was life or death for them to have this kind of connection, to have community. And a lot of the time, we allow convenience to rob us of that. We don't have that in our lives anymore. In reality, we're all living in Babylon. Everyone here this morning, not just POWs and captives, people sitting here this morning are living in Babylon. And it makes a huge difference in their lives when you say to them, God bless you. I'm praying for you. You matter to me, you matter to God. People need to hear the code. People still need to hear that. They need to be connected. Okay, let's keep going. Number 3, spiritually resilient people remember that their life and suffering have meaning in the eyes of God. Researchers write this: the factor that causes people to give up most often is not when their suffering gets more intense. It's when they believe their suffering has no meaning, no purpose. It isn't the intensity of the suffering, it's the meaninglessness of it. They go on to write that suicide notes rarely speak about failing health, rejection, finances, or even physical pain. They say things like, there's no point in going on. There's no reason for me to keep living. See, Daniel was a guy who believed that his life had meaning behind it. His suffering mattered. God saw it. God could use it. God could work through it. That's what he believed. I think that's what sustained him through that. In fact, we can even see in Daniel, there's another character at work here. It's easy to miss this character if we don't read carefully. So a character other than Daniel and his friends and Nebuchadnezzar and his servants. I'm going to read a few verses that has this character. I'm going to need you guys to help me out a little bit. See if you can pick out who this character is. We'll start at the end and work our way backwards. Daniel 1:17. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. Daniel 1:9. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. And then verse 2, the Lord gave him victory over Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Someone help me out here. Who's the character? Anyone? Shout it out if you know it. It's God. He's the character. The writer believes that God is up to something in Babylon. Even through that suffering, even in the middle of this terrible situation, even when the temple gets destroyed, the writer believes God is up to something. God is working through that God is involved in Babylon, that God sees that. He's the main actor here. So, I have a story. It comes from another pastor who spent some time visiting a convalescent state hospital while he was in college. It's something I think we ought to read as a church every few years. It's a powerful story. It'll take a minute, but it's worth it. The state-run convalescent hospital is not a pleasant place. It is large, understaffed, and overfilled with senile, helpless, and lonely people waiting to die. On the brightest of days, it seems dark inside and smells of sickness and stale urine. I went there once or twice a week for 4 years, but I never wanted to go there. I always left with a sense of relief. It's not the kind of place one gets used to. On this particular day, I was walking in a hallway that I had not visited before, looking in vain for a few who were alive enough to receive a flower and a few words of encouragement. This hallway seemed to contain some of the worst cases, strapped onto carts or into wheelchairs and looking completely helpless. As I neared the end of this hallway, I saw an old woman strapped in a wheelchair. Her face was an absolute horror. The empty stare and white pupils of her eyes told me that she was blind. The large hearing aid over one ear told me she was almost deaf. One side of her face was being eaten by cancer. There was a discolored and running sore covering part of one cheek, and it had pushed her nose to one side, dropped one eye, and distorted her jaw so that what should have been the corner of her mouth was the bottom of her mouth. As a consequence, she drooled constantly. I was told later that when new nurses arrived, the supervisors would send them to feed this woman, thinking that if they could stand this sight, they could stand anything in the building. I also later learned that this woman was 89 years old and that she had been here bedridden, blind, nearly deaf, and alone for 25 years. This was Mabel. I don't know why I spoke to her. She looked less likely to respond than most people I saw in that hallway. But I put a flower in her hand and said, "Here's a flower for you. Happy Mother's Day." She held up the flower to her face and tried to smell it, and then she spoke, and much to my surprise, her words, although somewhat garbled because of her deformity, were obviously produced by a clear mind. She said, "Thank you. It's lovely, but can I give it to someone else? I can't see it. I'm blind, you know." I said, "Of course," and I pushed her in a chair back down the hallway to a place where I thought I could find some alert patients. I found one and stopped the chair. Mabel held out the flower and said, "Here, this is from Jesus." That was when it began to dawn on me. This is not an ordinary human being. Later, I wheeled her back to a room and learned about her history. She'd grown up on a small farm that she managed with only her mother till her mom died. Then she ran the farm alone until 1950 when her blindness and sickness sent her to the convalescent hospital. For 25 years, she got weaker and sicker with constant headaches, backaches, stomach aches, and then the cancer came too. Her 3 roommates were all human vegetables who screamed occasionally but never talked. They often soiled their bedcloths, and because the hospital was understaffed, especially on Sundays when I usually visited, the stench was often overpowering. Mabel and I became friends over the next few weeks, and I went to see her once or twice a week for the next 3 years. Her first words to me were usually an offer of hard candy from a tissue box near her bed. Some days I would read to her from the Bible, and often when I would pause, she would continue reciting the passage from memory, word for word. Other days, I would take a book of hymns and sing with her, and she'd know all the words of the old songs. For Mabel, these were not just exercises in memory. She would often stop in mid-hymn and make a brief comment about lyrics she considered particularly relevant to her situation. I never heard her speak of loneliness or pain, except in the stress she played on certain lines in certain hymns. It was not many weeks before I turned from a sense that I was being helpful to a sense of wonder. and I would go to her with a pen and paper to write down the things she would say. What follows is a story behind one scrap of paper. During a hectic week of final exams, I was frustrated because my mind seemed pulled in 10 different directions at once with all the things I had to think about. The question occurred to me, what does Mabel have to think about? Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, not even able to know if it's day or night. So I went to her and asked Mabel, what do you think about when you lie here? And she said, I think about my Jesus. I sat there and thought for a moment about the difficulty of me thinking about Jesus for even 5 minutes. And I asked, what do you think about Jesus? She replied slowly and deliberately as I wrote. And this is what she said. I think about how good he's been to me. I think about how good he's been to me. He's been awfully good in my life, you know. I'm one of those kind who's mostly satisfied. Lots of folks wouldn't care much for what I think. Lots of folks would think I'm kind of old-fashioned, but I don't care. I'd rather have Jesus. He's all the world to me. And then Mabel began to sing an old hymn. Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my all. He's my strength from day to day. Without him, I would fall. When I am sad, to him I go. No other one can cheer me so. When I am sad, he makes me glad. He's my friend. This is not fiction. Incredible as it may seem, a human being really lived like this. I knew her. How could she do it? Seconds ticked and minutes crawled, and so did days and weeks and months and years of pain without human company and without an explanation of why it was all happening. And she lay there and sang hymns. How could she do it? The answer, I think, is that Mabel had something that you and I may not have much of. She had power. Lying there in that bed, unable to move, unable to see, unable to hear, unable to talk to anyone, she had incredible power. See, I think Mabel believed what Daniel believed, that God can work through that suffering. And now, years later, lots and lots of people know that story and are moved, hopefully, by Mabel and moved by Daniel. Their suffering has meaning. We can't forget that. Let's pray. God, come to you, and we ask that you give us the same power that Mabel had, same power that Daniel had. We never ever want to forget, God, that you're up to something in Babylon. That even when we're in our darkest moment, you're there with us. And you're doing something with it. And because of that, our suffering has real meaning to it. Because you're involved. And so, God, we give our lives to you because you're the only one who can bring that kind of meaning and purpose to our lives that makes it worth living. Give us that kind of power, God. Give us that kind of love and joy. May we thrive while we're living here in Babylon. Pray this in your name. Amen.